The topic of fibromyalgia, fog, and fatigue is a really important one, and it can sometimes be a little bit neglected compared to pain. And certainly, that is where most of the studies have been done in fibromyalgia, is looking at what causes fibromyalgia pain, getting closer to understanding that. Not quite 100% there, but getting closer. And a lot of, in fact, all the FDA-approved medications that we use to treat fibromyalgia all are focusing on pain. And certainly pain is a really huge component of this illness. But because for a long time that was all that was really looked at, the fatigue and fog have kind of been left behind as far as there's not many studies actually specifically looking at that and looking at treatments for that, which is really unfortunate because I definitely have seen, as a provider taking care of people with fibromyalgia, sometimes we can either find ways to address the pain or get it a little bit in the back burner so that it's not interfering as much with people's lives. But the fatigue and fog can be much harder and sometimes can be the more debilitating part. I've definitely had patients tell me, like, I can work through the pain, like meaning I can sustain employment, overcoming the pain, but the fatigue or brain fog can be really debilitating because if your brain isn't working, it makes it really challenging to work in most jobs, right? Like we need our brain. And certainly everything needs to be addressed, pain, fatigue, and fog. But just so you have that little background, sorry, my cat is trying to jump on my lap. He wants to come into the live, I guess. So because of that, that was something that I really focused on a lot with patients. And yeah, fatigue totally can knock you on your butt and can be really hard to explain, or people don't understand. People that don't have fibromyalgia don't always understand. The brain fog can be embarrassing and it can make us feel like, are we getting dementia? What's happening? So it can be really scary. So all that to say, there are actually ways to address it. But unfortunately, this is the piece that most doctors, even those that are more open-minded and willing to kind of help people with pain from fibromyalgia, they might not have much of an understanding of this. So it's important for patients to understand it more. And there are a lot of things that we can do for ourselves. So the first thing that I always look at when I'm trying to help a patient with fibrofog or fatigue is, of course, looking at sleep. And you've heard me talk about sleep a lot. I talk about it a lot in the book. I should probably do more of it. Like each of these things probably could warrant a full video, many blogs. But improving sleep quality is kind of a no-brainer, that if we're sleeping better, getting more refreshing sleep, we're going to be less fatigued. Our brain is going to function better. And those of you that were in the YouTube live that I did about sleep, remember that deep sleep is the time when our brain dumps out all the toxins and all the cellular, kind of the byproducts of cellular functioning, right? And so if we're not getting deep sleep, we have a brain that's clogged with all of these toxins, isn't maybe the right word, but things that are interfering with optimal functioning of our brain. And so the more we can get deep sleep, the better our brain will function. So kind of a no-brainer. Okay, hold on, please. That is my door. I'll be right back. Sorry. So the second thing is supporting cellular energy production. And by this, primarily, I mean mitochondrial support. And mitochondria are the little kind of furnaces or power generators in our cells. And what happens with the chronic stress response that we see in fibromyalgia is that it actually impairs the ability of the mitochondria to make energy as well. So the mitochondria, they function, they're just not as efficient. So what we can do to help them is actually improve and give them more of the cellular nutrients that they need, things like B vitamins, CoQ10, magnesium, all of those support better or more efficient mitochondrial function. So there's a whole chapter devoted to that in the FibroManual. In the FibroManual, I recommend a specific kind of multivitamin called Revitalize Nerve, which has a lot of those nutrients, but it's actually not a full multivitamin. So I've actually, since the publication of the book, I've kind of moved away from that. And these days, what I take and what I typically recommend is something like this, one multivitamin. It's a one a day, it's from Pure, and it's got a little bit of all the things that are needed to support your mitochondria. The other things we can do are, eat as healthfully as possible, those healthy fats. The mitochondria really love that. So increase your avocado, salmon, that kind of thing. And then improving our digestion so that we can actually absorb more of the nutrients from the food that we eat. Again, whole chapter in the FibroManual about how to do that. And this is just kind of an overview. So I'm sort of moving between topics, but bear with me. So the next huge piece, and this is an area where I spent a lot of time as a clinician working with folks, is on improving hormonal sources of fatigue. And this really comes down to two main categories. The first one is adrenal burnout, meaning our adrenal glands are not functioning as optimally as they should because they're being driven so hard by this chronic hyperactive stress response that ultimately they start tiring out, they start burning out. They're still functioning. It's not that they're not functioning, it's just that they are not functioning as well. And this is something that's really not recognized at all by Western medicine. It's a concept that's much more embraced in the naturopathic or integrative or holistic realm. And it's one of the things that most doctors, as open-minded as they are, they will not entertain the concept that adrenal burnout is actually real. And by doctors, I mean like Western medicine conventional providers. And the reason why that is because, and Anne brings it up, so when a standard conventional Western trained doc hears adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout, what they think you mean is adrenal insufficiency, which is a very poorly named condition where the adrenals actually stop working. They are literally not working. So insufficiency doesn't quite cover it. It basically is like the adrenals are not functioning versus the adrenals are functioning. What adrenal burnout is somewhere in that gray zone in between that, right? The adrenals are functioning, they're just not functioning as well as they should. And that can lead to a lot of fatigue. For me, that was a huge component of like addressing my adrenal burnout, which I didn't actually figure out until about maybe like a decade ago. That was what really kind of made the difference for me personally. And I've found that a lot for patients, but of course, everyone is different. I would say 100% of fibromyalgia patients have some component of adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout, but for some people it's a huge issue, other people it's a minor issue. So looking at that, and again, whole chapter in the FibroManual about that. The other hormonal piece is undertreated hypothyroidism. And again, this is an area where conventional Western docs have a very different idea about it than integrative or naturopathic or holistic docs. And part of that is because of just their training. Like in medical school, the training we get is very much, you go 100% based on labs. You really don't take as much into consideration what the patient is describing, which is unfortunate. Long story short, though, what can happen if you're somebody with fibromyalgia who also has hypothyroidism, the lab values that doctors are typically using to adjust your dosage can be artificially suppressed in fibromyalgia because of that chronic stress response. So I'll say this again because it can be a little confusing. So typically the lab value that a conventional doc is looking at to judge whether you either A, have hypothyroidism, or B, are adequately treated for that is a marker called TSH. And TSH, the higher it is, the more abnormal it is. So the higher it is, the worse your thyroid is functioning. What happens in fibromyalgia, though, the chronic stress response artificially suppresses it. So what you end up with is a TSH that can look normal, but actually not be normal. And so it's really important in fibromyalgia to not just rely on the TSH, to also look at the actual level of thyroid hormones, that's T3 and T4, and crazy concept, take the patient's symptoms into consideration. So again, a whole chapter about that in the FibroManual, but that is another big area that I see patients really suffer kind of needlessly from. Like if doctors just understood that one piece, I think a lot of people with fibromyalgia plus hypothyroidism would have a lot less fatigue. The other piece is if your adrenals aren't working well, it drags down your thyroid function. So even if you're getting the right amount of thyroid hormone, if you have adrenals that are not functioning well, your body can't utilize the thyroid hormone. So it's complicated. It's definitely complicated. But this is an area where naturopathic physicians far outshine any conventionally trained MD. They really understand the nuances of the hormone system. And I think they tend to do a much better job, frankly, of diagnosing and managing hormone-related causes of fatigue. So if you're struggling with something in that area and you have naturopathic physicians available to you, I think that's a really good option to consider, or look at kind of more integrative or holistic trained docs. Okay, so the next piece, so all of those that I've just talked about really can improve fog and fatigue. And by that, I mean improving sleep quality, improving your cellular and mitochondrial nutrition, addressing hormonal sources of fatigue. All of that can address both fatigue and fog. And fog and fatigue are pretty intertwined. Things that help one usually help the other. But there are some things that specifically really help fog more than kind of fatigue. And that one can be a little bit tricky. I would say fog is a pretty tricky thing for patients to both understand, because when you're so foggy, you can't even really figure out what's going on with you. It's hard to express yourself to a doctor saying, hey, I'm having a symptom. And then it's hard to judge, well, am I doing better? I guess I'm less foggy, but it just, fog complicates everything, right? It makes it hard to know how well you're doing as far as fog. So this is where I think getting third-party feedback, spouse, kids, partner, am I doing any better? That kind of thing. But one of the things that we tend to forget about the brain is that it is an organ just like any other, and it needs and requires good blood flow to bring enough oxygen to it. And this is an issue that can be problematic in fibromyalgia because a lot of us have low blood pressure. Low blood pressure enough that our brain actually might not be getting perfused as much, it might not be getting as much oxygen as it needs. So doing things to improve your blood pressure if it runs low, supporting your adrenals can help. Drinking more water, compression stockings, eating more salt, that kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. It's hard to understand things when the fog is bad. So another way that you can improve blood flow to the brain is through exercise. And I don't usually use that word. I prefer to use gentle movement. But in this case, I am meaning aerobic exercise that is getting your blood flowing to the point that you're getting more oxygen through your brain. Another way you can do this that doesn't involve exercise are things like saunas, things that increase your heart rate, right? Like getting in a hot tub, you'll actually notice that your heart rate will get faster, right? So your anything that increases oxygen blood to your brain, really important for fog. Also helps with fatigue, but when you're thinking about fog, that's a big one. Also, things that get more electrical energy into your brain can help with fog. So by this, I mean things like cranial electric stimulation, which is like little ear dealy bobs. See, I have a fog moment. I can't remember what they're called. The little ear things that it creates like a little source of electricity that flows between each ear. And it's pretty mild, but it can be enough to sort of give more brain energy. I've also had some patients get the same benefit from those light boxes, the light boxes we use for like seasonal affective depression. So getting more electrical functioning into your brain, more oxygen, more blood flow, all of that can help with fog. The final kind of piece that I'm going to talk about here are like medications that can help with fatigue and fog. And so these I view as sort of more like last resort options. Like, for example, we've tried everything we can to improve sleep, work on hormonal issues causing fatigue, improve nutrition, improve cellular energy production, but still having residual fog or fatigue. Then this is where I look at things like stimulants. So stimulants like we use in ADHD can actually really help fog. And in fact, fog looks a lot like ADHD when you undergo testing. So if somebody dealing with brain fog has a test, they will actually score as if they have ADHD and vice versa. So I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that a lot of the treatments for ADHD help with fog. Very controversial because any controlled substance is concerning to doctors, and they tend to be very unwilling to prescribe it, unfortunately. This is where, though, if you're dealing with symptoms, anything that looks like ADHD, actually getting an ADHD evaluation and a diagnosis for that can enable you to maybe get those treatments, whether it's fog or ADHD. If you can get the stimulant treatments, that can make a big difference. I mean, I have had stimulants make the difference for a patient between being able to stay employed and having to quit work. Like, that's how much of a difference it can make, like just life changing. And it's really infuriating that I get it, they're controlled substances, but it seems like doctors are just really, really unwilling to prescribe it. Another avenue I suggest to folks is, if their primary doctor is not willing to work with them on this, requesting going to a psychiatric nurse practitioner or psychiatrist, as those that specialty tends to feel more comfortable with both diagnosing things like ADHD and also with the treatment. So they're just more comfortable with things like stimulants. So those are also options to consider. Some of the medications that we use to treat fatigue and sleepiness due to sleep apnea, like modafinil and Provigil, can actually also help with both fatigue and fog. So a consideration, particularly if you also have sleep apnea that you're dealing with. And the final kind of medication group are some off-label uses that we have done, and one of them is memantine, which, if you heard my talk about reducing pain, you might remember that that is something we use off-label to treat fibromyalgia pain. But its original use is for dementia. So not that people with fibrofog have dementia, but the brain can respond to that memantine medicine in a way that it improves cognition. And that's basically what we're trying to do with treating dementia, is we're trying to slow that loss of cognitive function. And so I've found memantine to be quite helpful, and particularly if somebody we're also using it for pain, and then they get a secondary benefit of like, well, actually my brain, I feel less foggy. I'm like, that's great. Like that can be a good consideration. And then there's stimulating antidepressants, those that really affect the dopamine pathway, like bupropion. The brand name is Wellbutrin. I found that to be somewhat helpful, mildly, but somewhat helpful. And that's something that can often be added to another antidepressant because it works in a kind of a different mechanism. And then there's a couple herbs that are actually really helpful. Things like rhodiola, which are often used to treat adrenal burnout, can help both fatigue, but they actually improve cognitive function. And there's been rhodiola was really looked at in the Soviet Union in like the 50s and 60s. And what they found was that if they gave rhodiola to like astronauts, they were able to stay awake longer and they had better brain function. If students took rhodiola before an exam, they were less stressed by the exam and they actually did better. So I've heard of some college students in the US who figured this out and they actually use rhodiola like during finals. So anything that helps your heart and your spirit to feel better with fibromyalgia will absolutely help, because this illness takes a lot out of us. I think we do have to be fierce to fight it. And that is part of why I have started using the term fibro fierce. I don't love the term fibro warrior. While I understand kind of the sentiment, I feel like there's so much war and violence, and it just has always connotated to me a little bit of like I don't quite love that. So I decided that I'd try to make fibro fierce stick. So yeah, Reiki. Oh, I'm so glad that I have been helpful as far as helping people understand their health issues and what is fibromyalgia and what's not. Unfortunately, your doctor might not know that much about fibromyalgia, so we are often left to kind of figure it out ourselves. Because of fog, even if you've read the FibroManual, I encourage you to reread it, because on reread, you might get something different. Share it with your doctor if they're open-minded at all. And I'll keep making videos because people seem to like that format. I think it works well for the foggy brain. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for coming to my YouTube lives and being with me on this experiment, and for giving me, I always feel recharged just connecting with you guys, and I'm so glad that I can help. So with that, I'm going to go see what the situation in my basement is, and take care, everybody. Stay fierce.